Well, thank you all for coming. I think almost everybody's here. Um, all right. I hope you're all excited to travel back with me to a time when Anne's father Jeremy was a young pup just starting to forge his way in the world. I first learned of Jeremy, as perhaps many of you did, from the show Gentleman Jack, where he was deliciously portrayed by the estimable Timothy West. Later, I encountered him in Anne's diaries, and in both cases, Jeremy comes across as a bit of a bumbling fool, poor with money, vulgar, embarrassing to Anne, and overshadowed by nearly everyone in his life, but most especially his oldest daughter. But I was intrigued by the fact that as a young Army officer, he'd found himself at Concord and Lexington, the battles that became the opening salvo in America's war for independence. Luckily for us and for history, he wrote a retrospective account some years later of his time in the Army, a portion of which recounts this brief but fateful time in Boston. In this presentation, I want to explode that sliver of his life to put Jeremy's own words in context of the roiling political climate and also give you a fuller understanding of the British Army of the 18th century, and hopefully convince you that there's more to Jeremy Lister's character than his daughter was willing to allow. But first, a little bit about me. Just to establish my cred here, I do love Anne, even if I don't always see eye to eye with her on her father. I was born and raised in Concord, Massachusetts, which probably fed my interest in Revolutionary history, although I always carried a soft spot for the underdogs, which, of course, to me meant the British Army, because no one in Concord ever rooted for them. And finally, when I began my researches into Jeremy Lister, I came upon a group based out of Lexington, Massachusetts, that portrays Jeremy Lister's own regiment, the 10th of Foot, as they were in America during the Revolutionary years. So, of course, my wife and I had to join them. Let's get into our story. Jeremy Lister is just a few weeks away from turning 18. For context, that's about the same age Anne was when she was busy consorting with the Alexanders, living at Ellenroyd, and giving her parents heartburn by accepting invitations from men to examine their pistols and flageolets, which obviously, in Anne's case, is not metaphorical. Okay, the scene is Shibden Hall, the date August 13th, 1770. Aunt Phoebe, who is visiting Shibden, writes to Jeremy's brother James out in Scarborough, where he's been regularly crossing paths with his cousin William Fawcett. Cousin Fawcett has made a successful career of being in the Army and is, at this point, a colonel. Writing to James, Aunt Phoebe suggests, "It would not be amiss to talk with the colonel about your brother Jeremy, as nothing seems to chime in with him in the way of a trade." 1 week later, on August 21st, perhaps having the bug put in his ear by his sister, Jeremy's father also writes to James. "I have had some discourse with my son Jeremy. He tells me he has no dislike going into the Army. I would have you desire the Colonel Fawcett to buy your brother Jeremy a commission in the Army as soon as he can, with the convenience for the best advantage." Fawcett obliges, and by Christmas of that year, December 25th, 1770, Jeremy holds an ensign's commission in His Majesty's 10th Regiment of Foot. But let's pause for a minute. What is a commission? For that matter, what is an ensign? Briefly, a commission was how you bought your way into the Army. This served two purposes. First, they were a gate check. They ensured that the officer corps would be constituted of gentlemen, i.e., men of honor, unlike the rabble that they bribed in on the promise of a shilling who made up their usual rank and file. Someone who had the means to purchase his commission demonstrated that he, or at least his family, came from some level of wealth and was, therefore, a gentleman. The other purpose of a commission was to ensure that an officer was sufficiently invested in his position to not quit the service as soon as the going got hard. This was also important because it ensured the officer corps operated with a certain level of experience. An ensign is the cheapest commission at around £400 and the entry-level officer, so they are the most junior officers. There are 8 in every regiment, one for each hat company, and I'll explain regiment companies in further detail farther along. The ensign's particular job was to carry the colors, which are the flags a regiment flew on parade or took into battle. But like all officers, they were expected to be able to take command of the men if needed. One military manual from Jeremy's time is this one you see here, Cuthbertson's System, first published in 1768. Jeremy's regiment was a battalion of infantry, so this manual was applicable. Cuthbertson opines at some great length about the qualities best desired in an ensign, saying, "It is important to choose men of good caliber, because it is from these young plants he is to form the future prospect of the goodness of his corps." Accordingly, Cuthbertson suggests, when considering your ensign, look for gentlemen who have been educated in principles. A good figure, or at least a genteel one, is a circumstance to be also considered. In my own understanding, the emphasis the Army put on appearance at this time cannot be overstated, as much of its formidability rested on its ability to cut a striking, even dashing sight on the battlefield. Continuing on, from 16 to 19 is the best age for entering. According to Cuthbertson, this is because lads then are strong enough, educated enough, and not yet old enough to be intractably set in their ways. And finally, ensigns should not have been bred up amidst the corruption and vices of a metropolis. Jeremy, now Ensign Lister, joined his regiment across the ocean after a brief time in London and arrived in Quebec in the spring of 1771. When he'd been about 6 months there, the commanding officer of his regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, shared these sentiments with Colonel William Fawcett, the Lister cousin who had orchestrated Jeremy's commission. "I shall observe what you mention in a former letter respecting Ensign Lister, and I shall be very glad to do him all service. He is a very deserving young man, turns out extremely well, and I never desire a better recruit than him." Jeremy remained in Canada for about 3.5 years and expected to stay longer until General Thomas Gage, the commander in chief for the Army in North America, and also the recently appointed governor of the recalcitrant Massachusetts colony, summoned all his North American regiments to Boston to help quell growing provincial disturbances and unrest. Jeremy, in a letter home, reflects, "To what length they intend to carry their quarrel, it is impossible to know, but I hope it will be settled amicably. Otherwise, it will be a very disagreeable service we are now going upon." Jeremy and the 10th Regiment arrive in Boston in the autumn of 1774. The mood, in a word, is tense, an atmosphere of animus that has been ratcheting up over the course of years. In broad strokes, this animus is because an expensive and long war against France and her allies had recently been fought in the colonies by England and the provincials. The war so drained treasury funds by its conclusion in 1763 that the government in London felt compelled to recoup the money they thought the colonies owed England for protecting them. When the colonists, who weren't accustomed to such levels of taxation, balked at these acts, the government passed more acts designed to remind the colonists of their place, which was obedience to their king and government and its laws. Boston and the near regions in particular resented these acts and boycotted them, which led to more punishing acts, which led to more resentment and boycotting. As Boston's resentment and resistance grew, the Crown's military presence in Boston also grew. In November of 1774, Boston's population was about 16,000. When Jeremy disembarked with the 10th, their arrival swelled the number of forces in the city to 4,000, meaning 1 in 5 persons in Boston were soldiers. The place was and felt like an occupied city. In a letter home dated December 1st, 1774, Jeremy writes about the tensions he observes, saying, "By the disposition of people here, It is thought we should take the field early next spring. He also writes how the inhabitants have divided themselves into political factions, Whigs and Tories. The Whig party are by far the most numerous and very inveterate against government, so much as to think of attempting to take government into their own hands. And to his cousin, Colonel William Fawcett, he writes on December 2nd, the next day, the inhabitants are determined to defend what they call their liberties to the last extremity. But I hope next summer we shall humble them in such a manner as they will be glad to accept of such terms as the government will think proper to grant them. Jeremy's been in Boston only a few weeks, but already he can sense what a powder keg this place is. And speaking of powder kegs, powder houses and other munition depots play an important if indirect role in Jeremy's story. Without them, he is perhaps never wounded and conquered, and in the butterfly effect, who then can say if Anne Lister ever gets born? So during this time, the government kept stockpiles of gunpowder and other military supplies in secure repositories and garrisons that were sprinkled throughout the colonies. This was a very useful setup to have when, like in the last war, Englishmen Englishmen from the colonies and army needed ready supplies in their fight against France. Also, at the government's instigation, town militias too kept stores of armaments and powder in these repositories, which technically all these stores belong to the king. The idea being having colonials be able to defend themselves saved the crown money by lessening colonial dependence on the army. But in 1774, with the growing threat of rebellion, the king banned the further import of powder and arms into the colonies, and General Gage began dispatching his regulars to remove the king's powder and munitions out of the countryside, reasoning that a populace could not launch into actual armed rebellion if they were kept prudently unarmed. On the other side, provincials began working just as hard to get these supplies and secret them further into the countryside, where it would be difficult for the government to locate and seize them. Back in September, before Jeremy left Quebec but knew he was headed to Boston, he makes mention of this bitter competition in a letter home dated December 20th, 1774. It is reported that the Bostonians had got a large magazine of powder in the country a little way from Boston, which General Gage thought proper to send for. It being refused him, he sent a party of soldiers to take it by force, which the Bostonians resisted and drove back with the loss of 6 men killed on each side. The actual facts of what happened at the Somerville Powder House on September 1st differ considerably from the report Jeremy spread. Most importantly, no one was killed, or this would have actually been the notable first bloodshed of the Revolution. But Jeremy's letter illustrates how prized these military supplies have become for each side, and also how rumor and mistruth are quick to take hold in an atmosphere of distrust and mutual suspicion. Jeremy passes the winter in Boston, recalling in his journals of being in imminent danger every evening of being insulted by the inhabitants. The worst of language was continually in our ears, often dirt thrown at us, and they even went so far as to wound officers with their watch crooks, which I think is just a staff. As winter melted into spring, there was no thawing in hostilities. Indeed, to the contrary, Jeremy recounted in his journal that by March, things began now to draw near a crisis, and we expected daily coming to blows. And so we reached the evening of April 18th, 1775, when there was, as Jeremy recounted in his journal, a detachment ordered under arms to go on a secret expedition under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Smith of our regiment. The detachment consisted of the light infantry and grenadiers of the army. Now, Jeremy is not in the light infantry or the grenadiers, so he never got this order. His roommate, however, who was a grenadier, did. And Jeremy, being curious, follows Lieutenant Pettigrew down to Boston Common, where light infantry and grenadiers are just beginning to gather. One of the 10th Light Infantry's lieutenants, James Hamilton, is nowhere to be found. It will later be discovered that he had actually been feigning sickness that evening. But in the face of his current absence on the common, Jeremy, as he remembers in his journal, immediately offered myself a volunteer in the room of Hamilton. We're going to leave Jeremy again, but just for a minute, I promise. I want to touch on regimental structure because I think it's helpful for understanding Jeremy's story. So every regiment is made up of 10 companies, and a company for our purposes is about 40 men, though in reality the numbers varied widely depending on factors like illness, recruiting efforts, and of course during a war, casualties. 8 of these companies are called hat or battalion companies. A regiment stands in 2 long ranks, and hat companies are the ones in the middle. On each end of the regiment stood a flank company. Each of the 10 companies, is commanded by a captain or a field officer who's an officer of the whole regiment. For instance, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith commands the whole 10th Regiment, and he also commands one of its hat companies. And Jeremy is assigned to Smith's hat company in 1771, and he stays in it the whole time he's in America, with one exception, the night of April 18th, 1775, wherein he has just volunteered himself into his light infantry company as a volunteer lieutenant. Which begs the question, what is the light infantry? Light infantry is one of those 2 flank companies I mentioned. Cuthbertson, if you remember him from our last interlude, makes the recommendation that light infantry be trained in leaping, running, climbing precipices, swimming, skirmishing through woods, loading and firing at different attitudes at marks, and marching with remarkable rapidity. This is because light infantry's particular function is to move nimble and swift through the wooded and hilly terrain of America to skirmish the enemy. The light infantry company was formed by selecting the most capable soldiers from the 8 hat companies, men best suited to perform these specialized activities and duties. The other flank company are the Grenadiers, who was the other group singled out for this expedition. Grenadiers have different but equally specialized skills that I'm not going to get into. But understand, both flank companies hold the top skilled and trained men in a regiment. General Gage has put every flank company he has available to him onto this expedition because he knows it promises to be intense at best and dangerous at worst. However, even among these highly trained soldiers, most were as yet untested in battle. In that way, they are similar to Jeremy, who is fairly representative in age and years of experience of the average soldier in Boston at this time. Jeremy is 22, and he's been in the Army for about 4 years. The last time the Army was fighting a war, he was just a mere slip of a boy around 11 years old. So one final word. Why did Gage choose Jeremy's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith of the 10th Regiment, to lead this critical expedition? Smith was not young, he was a bit overweight and out of shape, and he was not overly elastic in his adaptability in a crisis. Quite simply, Gage chose Smith because he was the senior-most officer under Gage's command, and it was basically his due to have the honor of leading the expedition. So now we can return to Jeremy, who has been patiently waiting for us on Boston Common, where just an hour ago or so, he volunteered himself into his regiment's light infantry for an armed expedition. It's now close to midnight. A moon 3 days past full hangs in the sky, which casts good light for the clandestine operation. 800 soldiers wait to be rowed across the Charles River over to Cambridge to set out on their march. However, there are only 2 boats, so the soldiers must be ferried across in waves. As Jeremy is about to load into one of the boats, Lieutenant Colonel Smith sees him, and as Jeremy recalls, wished me to return to town again and not go into danger for others. But Jeremy is young, and he is headstrong like his daughter. And so, although only an ensign, he argues down one of the most senior officers in the whole army to talk his way into going on this expedition thinking it would be rather a disgrace for the company to march on an expedition, more especially being its first, without its complement of officers. An incoming tide forces the ferries to land in a particularly marshy spot where they can't properly dock, so the soldiers must jump into water past their knees. Now, April in Boston is very similar to April in Halifax, and the wee hours of April 19th were very likely cold, the water frigid. By the time the last soldiers ferried over to Cambridge, it's 2 in the morning, and everyone's leather shoes, canvas gaiters, wool stockings, and thick wool breeches are properly soaked from their marshy landing, and they're about to get wetter. Lieutenant John Barker, who is in the 4th Light Infantry and on the expedition, writes, "We began our march by wading through a very long ford up to our middles." Jeremy in his journal describes this portion as going through some swamps and slips of the sea. This was all done to avoid using a wooden bridge to get to the road, because Smith worried the sound of 800 pairs of boots and shoes might awaken the countryside and alert them to their secret expedition. He was not yet aware that Paul Revere and other rebel riders on horseback had already been spreading the word since about 11 p.m. The whole countryside already knew Gage's regular army was on the move before they ever took their first soggy steps. Jeremy, like every man and officer on the march, with the exception of Lieutenant Colonel Smith and his second in command, Major Pitcairn of the Marines, don't yet know at this point where they are going or why or how far even their destination is. But because Lieutenant Colonel Smith is in charge, his companies had the honor of marching in front. The 10th Lights, with their volunteer lieutenant, Jeremy Lister as one of them, marched at the very head of the whole column. The remaining light infantry marched behind them in ascending regimental order, the 4th, the 5th, the 18th, and so on. The grenadiers marched behind the lights in the same order, the 10th, then the 4th, the 5th, etc. There were a few companies of Pitcairn's Marines also, but I'm not going to get into that. About 5 miles, or 8 kilometers, Smith rested the men and then ordered Pitcairn to take command of the first 6 companies at the head of the column. Altogether, this was about 220 men and 18 officers, all of them light infantry. He was to march this vanguard detachment quickly ahead of the rest of the column. It's 3 or 3:30ish in the morning. Jeremy and the others in this vanguard, now under the unfamiliar command of a Marine, Major Pitcairn, still don't know where they're headed or why, but we, however, do. Gage has ordered Smith to march with the utmost expedition and secrecy to Concord, where he'd been informed rebels had amassed a large stockpile of arms. Smith has orders to destroy the stockpile, but Gage admonishes him, "You will take care that the soldiers do not plunder the inhabitants or hurt private property." He's also ordered Smith to send an advance party to secure 2 bridges in Concord as soon as possible. So Jeremy is in that group tasked to go with expedition some 15 miles, or about 24 kilometers, onto Concord to get those bridges secured. Spoiler alert, things don't go quite as planned. As they reach the outskirts of Lexington, Pitcairn orders his men to load their firelocks. Why does he do this? Well, by now he's aware that their march of expedition and secrecy, as ordered by Gage, has become neither. It's already 5 in the morning, and they're only as far as Lexington. And as for secrecy, Jeremy recounts in his journal, "The country people begun to fire their alarm guns, light their beacons to raise the country." Remember, couriers on horseback have been spreading the word of Gage's movements, and Pitcairn can hear a drum roll not far off that is summoning the Lexington militia to gather. So with muskets loaded, Pitcairn's vanguard marched to a small crossroad in the center of town where one road angled north and the other continued west to Concord. There was some confusion among the 6 light companies about which road they were meant to take, and the front three started erroneously towards the north, while the remaining three continued west. In the town green formed by these diverging roads stood 80 men of the Lexington militia, muskets at the shoulder. They were sending the message to Gage that they knew what he was up to and they didn't approve. From their perspective, the confused tangle of soldiers heading both north and west looked like an attempt to surround the militia. Adding to this tableau were small clumps of spectators standing on the grounds of the Buckman Tavern and other buildings that edged the town green. From Major Pitcairn's perspective, his detachment's confusion and the mob of denizens lurking in the shadows made an already tense encounter with an armed militia even more menacing. Jeremy recounts that Major Pitcairn called to the militia to disperse, but they're not seeming willing. He desired us to mind our space, which we did. Lieutenant Barker, who was there with the 4th Light Infantry, remembers it a little differently. We still continued advancing, keeping prepared against an attack, though without intending to attack them. On April 19th, 2025, we reenacted the events as they unfolded 250 years earlier.
Lay down your arms! You will not run me off of my common! Battalion! Fix your bayonets! Shoulder up! Charge up! Bayonets!
So nobody knows with certainty, even today, where that first shot came from or who fired it. But in the chaos, as you saw, the regulars disregarded their orders, and breaking ranks, they fired upon the scattering rebels until 8 colonists lay dead on the green. Lieutenant Colonel Smith arrived upon this scene with the rest of the column a short while later. But the unfortunate slaughter of 8 subjects of the king was not enough to dissuade Smith from aborting his mission, and he pressed his men on to Concord. In Concord Center, Smith took for his headquarters that Red Tavern, and as he divided up his search parties, he dispatched 6 light infantry companies north to where a suspected cache of arms lay in a farm some 2 miles past a bridge. This small detachment was under the command of Captain Parsons of the 10th Lights, and so off they popped, and unbeknownst to everyone involved, they would soon enough inveigle themselves once more into America's story. The North Bridge spans the placid Concord River. Here, Parsons posted his own 10th along with the 4th and 43rd Companies to stay at the bridge and hold this ground, while he led the other 3 up the road to the farm he was to search. This North Bridge is Parsons' only means of return, and so he wants to make sure it stays well guarded. It's 8:30 in the morning, about 9 hours since the rebels first began to spread the alarm. Most knew Gage's likely aim was Concord. Accordingly, Minutemen companies had been making their way to Concord ahead of the rest of their militias. Like light infantry, Minutemen are a militia's nimble and fleet-footed fighters, so named for their ability to be ready, armed, and assembled in a minute's notice. As these Minutemen and some of the militia from nearby neighboring towns reached Concord, they mustered in the fields on the hills overlooking the Concord River. Their numbers are around 500, and rumors have started to trickle among them about the fatal encounter in Lexington 3 hours earlier. No one is certain what to believe, but they are alarmed and rattled. Jeremy and the 10th have taken up a post atop the hills over the river to watch the route Parsons must travel. The 4th has taken another post on these high grounds, while the 43rd remains down below at the bridge. Altogether, there are no more than 120 men. Jeremy writes, "We had not been long in this situation when we saw a large body of men drawn up with the greatest regularity and approached us seemingly with an intent to attack." He agrees with his lieutenant Kelly that it seemed most proper to retire from our situation, and they join with the 4th for safety in numbers as the rebels continue to advance towards them. At this point, Jeremy remembers, "It was thought proper by the officers, except myself, to join the 43rd Company at Concord Bridge. This means walking downhill, and Jeremy worries that had the rebels wanted to, they might have cut us off almost to a man." And indeed, they probably could have, but the colonials, though hostile and armed, are not actually acting in deliberate aggression, only determined defense. Nevertheless, Captain Laurie, who commands the bridge party, sends for reinforcements from Smith. He doesn't know that from the colonials' vantage on the hill, they can see fires smoking in Concord Center. The colonials don't know these fires are because grenadiers are burning cannon carriages that they've confiscated from the rebel stockpile. They also don't know that when a nearby building does accidentally catch fire, the regulars and townspeople work side by side to save the building and extinguish the fire. They only see smoke, and they believe the town is being wantonly burned and plundered by the regulars. Their only means into town is over that bridge, and so that is where they want to head. Captain Laurie, who only sees an army 4 times his own strength advancing on them, orders his men over the bridge, which puts them in a better defensive position. For good measure, they take up some planks of the bridge, which Jeremy is happy to claim credit for. He writes, "I propose destroying the bridge," although I can't confirm whether it was actually his idea alone, because another volunteer, Mr. Sutherland, reports being the first one to raise a plank. But perhaps they can sort out between the two of them who it was who lost the colonies for England, because that move, the destruction and damage of property, compounded with the earlier fatalities in Lexington and the current fires in Concord, struck the colonials across the bridge as nothing short of a galling provocation. One more example of lawless, unchecked behavior from their own government. Jeremy records the fallout from this ill considered action. "Before we got one plank up, they got so near as to begin their fire, which was a very heavy one." His implication is the colonials fired first, although Captain Laurie, in his official and contemporaneous testimonial, allows, "I imagine myself that a man of my company, afterwards killed, did first fire his piece, though Mr. Sutherland has since assured me that the country people fired first." Historical consensus seems to side with Laurie's initial account that his side fired first. And so began the second deadly skirmish of an expedition that was supposed to have been bloodless. This time, both sides suffer casualties. It's important to remember, though, each conflict has broken out not because of deliberately provoked aggression, but primarily because of suspicion and misinterpretation exacerbated by fear. Yet, once shots rang out, Jeremy writes, "The weight of their fire was such that we was obliged to give way, then run with the greatest precipitance. The scattering regulars run into Smith's Johnny-come-lately reinforcements. The colonials, who are equally discombobulated by all that has just transpired, do not pursue the retreating army, and Parsons, when he returns around noon, crosses over the bridge without incident. With his men returned, Smith marches his column, now with 4 wounded officers and a sergeant, and absent 3 privates, dead back at the bridge, towards Boston. By now, Jeremy and the men have been up for 30 hours or more, have waded through frigid swamp waters, have marched 18 miles or 29 kilometers, and 7 of the 21 companies have been fired on. Many, including Jeremy, have not eaten anything, and their day is only half over. Heading from Concord, Smith keeps the grenadiers on the road, and Jeremy with the light infantry are sent up this hill to protect the column's flank as militia are now crawling the hill's ridges. Meanwhile, more militia companies from towns are arriving. The rebel numbers are 1,100 and still growing. At a crossroads, Jeremy and the light infantry must descend the hill to join the grenadier column. Near this junction, a small brook with a narrow bridge has the effect of creating a choke point for the retreating British army. Jeremy writes, "Immediately as we descended, the rebels begun a brisk fire, but at so great a distance it was without effect. As the light infantry rejoin the column, the grenadiers give them cover against the approaching rebels." Jeremy's journal recounts, "When the grenadiers found them within shot, they returned their fire. Just about that time, I received a shot through my right elbow joint. It then became general firing upon us from all quarters." Jeremy's words capturing this moment are immortalized on a national park sign that stands directly at this spot. Because this moment in time and place, this spot where Jeremy is shot in the arm, marks an inflection point of history. This is where it can be said the war began. It's at this intersection, Miriam's Corner in Concord, Massachusetts, where colonials assumed for the first time a position of open aggression and fired their first belligerent shots. No longer are they aiming only in defense or in reaction to tensions that have inadvertently combusted into something deadly. Rather, the ball that shatters Jeremy's elbow is shot by one of his own countrymen who has made the consequential decision to take up active arms against his government. Unfortunately for Jeremy, the significance of his shattered elbow at this particular junction remains our privilege of historical perspective. For poor Jeremy, he still has nearly 20 miles to go, and whatever he's bleeding out, there is really nothing he can do. His thick wool coat is probably absorbing much of his blood as he and the other walking wounded keep a pace in the column as though their lives depend upon it, which they very, very much do. Town militias from all over the region still continue to pour in from both the north and the south. These rebels, fresh and armed, and acting with the collective understanding that there can be no turning back from their actions now, will harass, dog, pursue, and fire upon the retreating column of beleaguered regulars, shooting at them from behind the protection of stone walls and trees, while the regulars fight their desperate way on the road towards Boston. Lieutenant Barker of the 4th Light Infantry recounts, "In this way we marched between 9 or 10 miles, their numbers increasing from all parts, while ours was reducing by deaths, wounds, and fatigue. Our ammunition was likewise expended." So dire was their situation by the time they reached Lexington that every man in Smith's column might easily have been killed or captured. The provincial numbers were 2,000 and still growing. Smith's column of 800 men was reducing with every mile. If reinforcements hadn't come when they did, death or capture would surely have been Jeremy's fate. But Lord Percy saves the day when his column of 800 fresh soldiers and 2 cannons reach Smith just in time near the Monroe Tavern. The Monroe Tavern, under the protection of Percy's cannons, becomes a temporary field hospital for the wounded, including Jeremy. There, a surgeon's mate extracts the ball from Jeremy's elbow, probably with his fingers. It will be the task of another Lister altogether to educate the medical field in antiseptic practices. With arm wounds like his, it was typical for a surgeon to ultimately remove the limb, but Jeremy was lucky to be met with a doctor in Boston who took pains to keep the arm of someone so young. Remember, Jeremy is not yet 23. He will never bend his elbow again, but luckily he will retain the ability to write, which, all things considered, is remarkably legible. After a brief half-hour respite, Jeremy and the rest of Smith's weary column, surrounded by Percy's men, made their way back towards Boston. Jeremy writes, "From our long, fatiguing march and loss of blood for 9 miles, want of provisions having not had a morsel since the day before, I begun to grow rather faint." And he appeals to Lieutenant Colonel Smith to give over his horse so that Jeremy may ride on his horse for this part of the march. It will prove to be the deadliest stretch of their day. 4,000 colonials from 30 towns have joined the fight, and casualties on both sides mount as they pass through Metonymy. Jeremy recalls, "I found the balls whistled so smartly about my ears, I thought it more prudent to dismount, and as the balls came thicker on one side or the other, so I went from one side of the horse to the other for some time." By the time Percy finally gets his men to the safety of Charlestown, it is evening and darkness is falling. From here, the soldiers are ferried back into Boston. After landing, Jeremy writes, "I then proceeded through the town to my lodgings, where I arrived about 9 o'clock." He remembers the march being 60 miles, though in reality it was less than 40. Still, the distance he covered that day, if my Google Maps skills are to be trusted, is the equivalent of walking from Shibden Hall to the Goodrham Gate Chapel in York, a distance of about 38 miles. And for almost half of it, he was under direct and relentless assault, so I think we can forgive him his hyperbole, all things considered. An expedition that had begun 23 hours earlier was finally over, although the war it had sparked was only just heating up. We end our story back at Shibden Hall. The Leeds Intelligencer carried news of the events of April 19th. This first report is decidedly biased, as the cunning rebels managed to get their account written, delivered, and disseminated across England practically before General Gage had finished writing his official report. This quote gives you the general flavor of the article, which Jeremy's family likely read in the June 6th edition of the Leeds Intelligencer. "Last Wednesday, the troops of His Britannic Majesty commenced hostilities upon the people of this province, attended with circumstances of cruelty not less brutal than what our venerable ancestors received from the vilest savages of the wilderness." 4 days after that, on June 10th, the Leeds Intelligencer ran another report. This one was the official account from General Gage, and it listed Jeremy among the wounded, giving the listers their first inkling that their Jeremy was involved in the scrape with the colonials nearly 2 months before. A few days after that, a letter from the 10th Regiment Major Henry Bassett assured the listers that Jeremy, while wounded, was recovering, and then included these sentiments. "It is my duty as Major of the regiment to inform you that your son Ensign Lister is very much esteemed by everyone in this regiment. He acted as Lieutenant of Light Infantry on this command. No gentleman could have behaved with more spirit, and he does honor to his regiment." He ends with a postscript which indirectly alludes to the fact that since April 19th, an army of rebels from all over New England has been laying siege to Boston, cutting the city off from all goods of the land. His postscript also touches on a recurring theme that will follow Jeremy his whole life. "Jerry tells me he has not any money, and will be obliged to get an officer to draw on you for 20 to 30 pounds. You can't imagine the dearness of this place. Not a pound of fresh meat to be got at any price. An egg, 3 pence. He deserves every assistance. Whilst I have a guinea, he shall have half." Given such praise, it's interesting to note that Major Bassett, not a year earlier, was given a proper dressing down by his inferior, Ensign Lister, when their paths crossed at Fort Erie. But that is a story for another day. To conclude this story, after a harrowing convalescence for his elbow and months of living under siege, Jeremy returned to England in early 1776 with a lieutenant's promotion and recruited for the army, but struggled to reintegrate into the rhythms of daily life. Though, in some juicy hot gossip, he did manage to rekindle relations with a worthy lady in London who first won his affections in 1771, right before he left for America. So there's tons more to Jeremy's story than what I've covered, but I hope this has opened the door a little into appreciating who he was in his own right and to see just a bit beyond his daughter's judgment. And if you ever find yourself in Boston and want a Jeremy Lister tour, definitely you can hit me up because I'm happy to give them. And thank you. That is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Liza. That was really, really fantastic. And what a wonderful insight into Jeremy, who I know, as a result of Gentleman Jack, is a much loved kind of character too. So we are going to head into some questions, if that's okay. I think we've got around 10 minutes or so. So the first question is one specifically around kind of army. And that is, was there an upper age limit for light infantry?
That is a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. An upper age limit. Yeah, that I actually don't know the answer. I could make something up, but I better not. So,
No,
I
of
mean,
course, of course, we
they
can find out.
right. I mean, that's something I will look into. I mean, generally, you had to, like, I think that they, wanted fit, able men. So, but
Sure.
that is actually a really great question. Um,
It will somebody will find themselves down a rabbit hole somewhere finding it out. But I think the kind of assumption that if you're fit and you're healthy and you meet all of the other requirements, kind of age perhaps was not so much of a concern. But we'll find out for sure. A few questions specifically about Jeremy now.
mhm.
So what is your favorite story or episode from Jeremy's time in America?
Oh, that's a good question. Honestly, I think the one that I alluded to, where so this is when he's in Canada, and he is um, he's only an ensign, but he is the commander of Fort Erie with about 30 men under his command, and they've gotten the orders that they're going to have to go back to Canada. And so Major Bassett is leading his regiment out from Michigan, basically, back through Fort Erie, and starts, as a major in the regiment, starts ordering this ensign around. And Jeremy's like, I'm the one in charge here. Like, I'm the commander. You are subservient to me, and I cannot believe that. Like, I thought we were friends, and you're ordering me around. Like, no, 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 no. And so it just kind of proves his. I can see where Anne gets her sort of headstrong
Yeah, that's
next.
exactly what I was just thinking. I was like, that makes sense. Now we can see how that translates down into Anne's life. And no, I mean, the second half of that question, as it was written, was is it the one about marching a number of miles to finally get his tea? Which I think is one of the ones that is most known amongst Gentleman Jack and Anne Lister kind of researchers. So it's so lovely to hear another anecdote from Jeremy's life and time in America.
Yeah,
Um,
there's also there's another one. I mean, well, rekindling the relations with this woman was, another little tidbit. He also has one that the handwriting is a little hard to decipher, but he is back in England and joining a hunting party with his lieutenant friends, and he's trying to get to them and like shortcutting through a field, and he jumps over a wall and like ends up into this mud pit basically up to his armpits, and can't get out on his own, and so like needs help getting out because he
sure.
just kind of like launched tried to take the quick way over.
That's definitely an image, isn't it? So we've just had a comment come in from friends of the summit, Pat and Pat, who are absolutely going to take you up on your offer to tour the area. They've said that they were there for the 200th anniversary to see the reenactment then, and they'd love to kind of take you up on that offer to go and have another tour. So lovely to see you, Pat and Pat.
Definitely.
Second question then about Jeremy. Had he not been poked into the army by family, what do you think Jeremy might have done with his time?
That again is a great question. And, I don't know. I mean, as he was the fourth son until only a year earlier. And it wasn't like, so, and then suddenly everybody kind of gets moved up a rank, right? Within the family, but he didn't come from great wealth. So, and reading Aunt Phoebe's lines and reading what his father wrote, I mean, you can kind of read between the lines that Jeremy is sort of this dreamy, drifting sort of soul. He does in the army, he does take up the flute, but he sort of does that because it doesn't cost as much money as going to the taverns. I mean, I think he did, you know, have an interest in the flute, but he also was sure to point out to his family that this was like way more economical of a hobby than buying rounds of drinks for the other officers. So, I don't know exactly what he would have done. He does also mention in one of his letters how much he loves planting trees and like how much he just sort of loves being in nature. And when he's in Canada, he talks about working hard to get the hay and the wood in, and also in the springtime, like really getting the garden to bear usable fruit or usable food. I mean, he's kind of proud of the fact that his garden is growing useful things. So I think that I think he did have kind of this gardening interest. But there was just like money was always a pressure for him. And honestly, I think a lot of that had to do because of being an officer in the army. Like, you're expected to maintain this certain level of lifestyle that the army doesn't really like pay you to be able to afford, because they assume that you have familial wealth. And so he didn't have familial wealth, and so he's always just kind of trying to scrape what he can. And I think that really like set him on his path, where he was just kind of always scrounging for money. But I mean, I think from his letters and stuff that he might have been very happy as a farmer. I mean,
Sure.
um, yeah, without sort of pressures to be a gentleman.
Absolutely. No, there's a lovely reflection from Sarah in the chat. Playing the flute or drinking with the lads is such a funny dichotomy, which is one way of looking at it. um, Final question then, and I'm sure somebody somewhere, it definitely came to mind, was thinking, Jeremy, farmer, Shibden Hall, perhaps not. In Anne's view, maybe things would have ended up differently. But anyway, we'll head on to the final question. So Rebecca Lister wasn't keen on Sam Lister joining the army. Did Jeremy ever share an opinion about his son joining up before or after his death?
That's something I don't know, because I really haven't gotten to that part of his life yet.
Mhm.
And I haven't read anything where he alludes one way or to, or where somebody else alludes to what he might have thought. So again, that is an interesting question, and I'm kind of excited to sort of dive more into that part of
Sure.
Jeremy's life.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's so much left to discover, I guess, which is what's so exciting about all of this. And I'm sure there are the kind of people out there who have been watching and will be watching on YouTube after the event as well, that are sort of, it springs out different memories and different rabbit holes to kind of dive into. So so much ground to cover. It's been really, really fantastic to hear from you, Liza. Some comments as well coming through about really want to kind of hear about more about your future research and things like that. So we're going to have to find other ways perhaps to get you involved in Pact with Potential and getting that research out there for people to read and engage with. Thank you so much. We don't have any more questions, so we'll bring the session to a close perfectly on time. And we're going to just hand over to Steph to transition into our final session of the day, which is the peak party. But thank you so much, Liza. Lots of virtual rounds of applause coming your way.
Great. Yeah, no, thank you. This was great.